Well, as they said this morning, the conference officials, you are the ones who showed up. That's important, right? You showed up. So we're glad you're here. Some of you may not have been here for our parts 1, 2, and 3. I know Marilyn was enjoying sunny California for a couple of those.
We'll show you a picture after the service of my being out there too.
Yes. So I thought perhaps we would have an overview of parts 1, 2, and 3 before we did part 4. And I also have some books to show you. Marilyn, you can see the pictures there in the Haskell book. And I promised you I would bring some of Haskell's books with me. These are originals. Do treat them carefully, okay? And I will refer to them in my... I'll just start that one here. Start this is over here, Jim. Okay, there's a little one. Okay. I will refer to those in part 4, but I just thought I'd start them around. Part 1, 1833 to 76. We learned that S.N. Haskell was born in Oakham, Massachusetts, 1833 or 34. Health problems prevented him from going to school for very long, but he was a voracious reader. And we learned that he had an extensive personal library worth $2,000. He taught himself logic and how to improve his sentence structure by studying algebra. Imagine that, algebra taught him logic. He could plow fields, build bridges, drain land, erect fences. We talked about a machine he invented called the Haskell to help get the stakes out of the ground. Basically a lever mounted on wheels. Use fulcrum, pull up the tent stakes. He sold soap door to door. He read his Bible voraciously every year. By the time he died, he'd read the Bible through 73 times. Some of you are falling a little bit behind that schedule. 73 times. In the 1840s, he joined the Congregational Church, which was his parents' church. But in 1850, he converted to Methodism, became a Methodist preacher, exhorter in New England. 1851, we learned when he was 17 years old, he married an invalid named Mary Howe, and she was 38. 17 marrying 38. He converted to Adventism in 1854. Joseph Bates was instrumental in his conversion. Became a very, very strict vegetarian. In fact, you may remember from part 1 that Ellen White rebuked him for making pork a test of church fellowship before she had had a vision on that subject. He could be narrow-minded, rigid, judgmental, but he was also very principled, very courageous, very sincere, zealous for the truth. Positives and negatives. He accepted Ellen White's testimonies to him, became one of her leading defenders. He raised up a church in South Lancaster, Massachusetts. He created a lot of blank forms. He liked filling out forms because it showed progress of the cause. He was ordained in 1868, became president of the New England Conference from 1870 to 1887. That is the longest term of conference leadership among any of our pioneers. He vigorously promoted the publishing work, Vigilant Missionary Society, Tracted Missionary Societies in New England, New York, and all the way up to the General Conference level. And because of his administrative talent, we discovered that he was appointed to some very important committees, the General Conference Committee, the Publishing Association Committee, the Sanitarian Board, President of the General Tracted Missionary Society, and several others. That's part 1. Part 2, 1876 to 94, we learned that Stephen and his wife Mary founded a school in South Lancaster. And those of you that were on my tour, I see 1, 2, 4, all right. So somebody's missing. I see 4 of my alumni here who were actually there at that time. I think these slickers are missing tonight, aren't they? Okay. All right. And we actually went there, 1882, to the Founders Hall. That was the building that he built. And South Lancaster Academy grew out of that, and South Lancaster. Also had a college there for a while, Atlantic Union College. He promoted ministerial institutes for pastors and teachers, and he assisted some of the other leading denominational pioneers like Canright and James White and Andrews and Uriah Smith in promoting a new tithing plan, 1878. He preached at camp meetings all up and down the West Coast, from California to Oregon. He spent sometime 6 months in 1882 traveling through Europe, England, France, Switzerland, Norway, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and served on the European Council over there. He was elected president of the Maine Conference, 1884. He popularized a new Bible reading format, and that little book is going the rounds. Haskell's little Bible study booklet there, sort of pocket size. 1885, the General Conference sent him to Australia and New Zealand, and he started a new printing press there, a new paper, the Bible Echo, and started the practice of putting Adventist tracts inside of wine bottles and beer bottles. I'm fairly certain he didn't grade the contents himself, but he got the bottles from somewhere, and he would throw them into the ocean and pray that the Lord would lead them to those who might benefit from the truth contained within. In 1887, the General Conference sent him to Europe again, and he started a new school in England. Haskell was also the one who chaired the 1888 General Conference session there in Minneapolis. 1889 to 91, he went with Percy T. McGann, and they visited England and Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Portugal and South Africa and Australia, India and China and Japan. Kind of makes me tired just thinking about it, right? I mean, my tours are fairly short compared with their tour. And they did mission work among the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Buddhists and the Confucians. Between 1891 and 94, he was elected president of the California Conference, which at that time, Maryland, also included Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. So it was a pretty big conference. And then we closed part two by the sad news of his wife Mary's death at age 80 of a stroke. And then he returned to Europe and South Africa for preaching tours. Now, 3 weeks ago, when I was here, we did part three. Some of you will remember that, 1894 to 1905. In 1894, Haskell and Uriah Smith, with his son Wilton Smith, traveled to England and Holland, and then Stephen went on to South Africa and Australia. In Australia, Elder Haskell taught religion at Avondale College, which was a brand new school that he and Ellen White helped to establish. And we talked about how he asked Ellen White to marry him, and how she gave 15 reasons, basically, why she wouldn't. I don't know that she gave them all directly to him, but at least the historian I read indicated that there were about 15 reasons she decided not to marry. But they were very close. Instead, she recommended Plan B, Hetty Hurd, right? Why don't you marry Hetty Hurd? And he certainly did. And at that point, 1897, he was 64, and Hetty was 39. So he kind of reversed the age ratio. When he was 17, he married a 38-year-old. And when he was 64, he married a 39-year-old, kind of robbing the cradle there. Hetty taught physiology, geography, and was matron or cafeteria director at Avondale. In 1898, Stephen was elected president of the New South Wales Conference, and he and Hetty held camp meetings and evangelistic meetings all over the continent of Australia. 1899, they returned to the U.S. for camp meeting tours across the country, basically from Michigan to California. And then they went south and helped to establish the Graysville School in Tennessee, which today, of course, is Southern Adventist University in Collegedale. And they also helped to establish the Oakwood School, which today is Oakwood University in Alabama. And they also helped to establish the Keene School, which today is Southwestern Adventist University in Keene, Texas. In In the 1890s, the Haskells combated fanaticism, such as Anna Rice, who claimed to be a prophet, and the Holy Flesh movement in Indiana. At first, Stephen opposed the reorganization of the General Conference in 1901, but Ellen White persuaded him that it was God's work and he should support it, and so he did. He and Ellen White fought a joint battle against the Review to get their just royalties. Royalties had been reduced from 50% to 10%. And so they were on the same side on that battle. From 1901 to 1912, Stephen and Hetty, we learned, pioneered inner-city evangelism in several of the large cities of the United States, like New York City, Nashville, San Bernardino, Oakland, and Portland. And they gave Bible studies door to door, selling magazines, giving in-home health treatments, and they won 90 converts. Stephen organized the first black Seventh-day Adventist church in New York City in 1902. He and his wife Hetty started a new magazine called the Bible Training School in New York City. The four basic authors were Stephen, Haskell, and Hetty, Jan Lepro, and Ellen White. And that new magazine actually lasted until her death in 1919. We learned he was unwisely engaged in what I called a tempest in a teapot, the debate over the daily, all right? The daily sacrifice, Daniel 8. Was it Roman paganism, or was it papal ecclesiastical structure? And Ellen White begged the participants to stop arguing about this minor matter. Some did, others, like Stephen Haskell and Jan Lepro, did not stop. We learned that Haskell was basically a verbal inspirationist. He saw every single word that Ellen White wrote anywhere as infallible and as authoritative as the Bible itself, a claim she never made herself. Willie White warned him that this view could injure Ellen White's work by claiming more for her writings than she claimed for them. So that's kind of where we left off in part 3. Part 4, 1905 to 1922, will complete Haskell's life, and then I'll open it up to you for the many questions that you have written down over the last 3 weeks, okay? As busy as Stephen Haskell was traveling, preaching, organizing, and serving on conference and institutional boards and committees, he somehow found time to write. In addition to sending scores of reports and articles to our church papers, he also wrote books. Convinced that readers needed something shorter and easier to understand than Uriah Smith's lengthy books on Daniel and Revelation, Stephen Haskell prepared a book in 1901 called The Story of Daniel the Prophet. 6 years later, the Review issued an illustrated edition of this book, and I'm circulating an original copy of it among you. And then in 1905, his book, The Story of the Seer of Patmos, was published. And that, of course, focused on John and the book of Revelation. These were more devotional in nature, less academic, scholarly, detailed, which is the way Uriah Smith wrote. Now, I should mention at this point that although Uriah Smith and Stephen Haskell had crossed swords with each other 20 years before over the Battle Creek College issues, Uriah Smith kindly served as Stephen Haskell's consultant for these two books, and he even agreed to write introductions for both of the books. You may notice that as you're looking at them. That was very kind of Uriah Smith to do that. And then in 1914, Stephen Haskell published his third book, The Cross and Its Shadow. An original copy of that is going around as well. That was published through his Bible Training School in South Lancaster. It explored Old Testament typologies in the yearly feasts and the Levitical laws and ceremonies that pointed to Christ's ministry in the New Testament and in the heavenly sanctuary. Well, Ellen White had been disappointed in his first two books on Daniel and Revelation. She still felt they were too long, too detailed. He should have combined Daniel and Revelation as Uriah Smith had done, she felt. She was quite thrilled by this third book, the third book, The Cross and Its Shadow. Frequently, her helpers found her reading it in her study. It brought her comfort and cheer. Unfortunately, not everyone shared Mrs. White's enthusiasm for Stephen Haskell's books. Naturally, the Review and Pacific Press and Southern Publishing Company were annoyed that he had published that third book independently of them. Furthermore, after the tragic 1902 fire in Battle Creek that destroyed the publishing house, which also destroyed copies of Haskell's books, I.H. Evans, the publishing house manager, demanded that he sell him books at a price that was actually well below Stephen Haskell's actual cost. Stephen Haskell wrote, "I am tired of this continual fight with the brethren. Every man that does any aggressive work will be knocked in the head if they can possibly down him." You sense that annoyance. Ellen White could certainly empathize. Despite these setbacks, Haskell continued writing. By 1917, he had published 8 of Ellen White's books, Edson White's Gospel Primer, and his own book, Cross and Its Shadow, in Braille editions for those who were blind. He even succeeded in placing most of these books in public libraries. And then in 1919, he completed his final volume, the little pocket-sized Bible handbook, and there's a copy of that going around as well. It was a collection of scripture texts covering more than 220 topics. But everything you could imagine, and then some, interspersed with Ellen White statements and historical quotations. Well, the book is still in print today. We as Adventists would not accept some of Elder Haskell's interpretations. And I'll just share with you one of his really far out ones. You can check it out for yourself. For example, he has the prophet Nahum, Old Testament prophet, predicting railroad travel, automobiles with headlights, and airplanes. And he bases this on Nahum chapter 2, verse 5, and Nahum 3, verses 16 and 17. You can read that later and see if that's what you get out of it. Many of his statements in the section called Bible etiquette would certainly no longer be considered politically correct today. As mentioned earlier, in 1904, Stephen and Hetty moved down to Nashville, Tennessee, to start one of the Bible training schools with the help of Luther and George Burgess. They were old friends from South African days. They had recently returned from India. Their evangelistic meetings grew in attendance to include 125 citizens of Nashville. But the Yankees, who tried to spread the gospel among whites and blacks in the Jim Crow South, faced some strong opposition. This was an era when dozens of black people were being lynched every year. Furthermore, the local white-administered conference refused to give them financial support. So, the Haskell's endeavors were largely self-funded. Throughout 1904 and 5, as the Nashville Project faced $500 in expenses, that was quite a lot of money in those days, when $1 a day was a good wage, Hetty continued pleading with the church leaders to send more helpers and to provide salaries for them. For their part, some church officials, resenting the fact that people were giving money to this self-supporting work without funneling it through the regular church channels. Have we heard that argument in our day? I think we have. Asked for a list of donors and the amount of their donations so they could deduct an equivalent amount from the institution's official appropriations. Some of them also insisted that the local conference should audit Madison books, threatening to send letters to Adventist young people urging them not to attend the Madison school if the Haskells refused to comply. So you see, denominational politics was very much alive in those days. To add insult to injury, the civil authorities of the city of Nashville ordered the Southern Publishing Association to shut down its presses on Sundays in compliance with local Sunday blue laws. Across the Bible Belt South, many, many Adventists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found themselves behind bars or laboring on chain gangs for doing church work on Sunday. Adventist efforts to establish sanitariums, schools, vegetarian restaurants, and hydrotherapy treatment facilities in the Deep South often met with that kind of opposition from local authorities who rigidly enforced Sunday laws. Despite these challenges, though, the Haskells and their colleagues accomplished much in Madison. In 1904, Percy T. McGann, Nellie Drouillard, Ellen White, and the Haskells started the Madison School. That's the predecessor of Madison Academy, Madison College, and the Madison Hospital. Church leaders insisted that Stephen and Hetty hold the title in their own name and act as trustees until the institution could be chartered with the state, which it was, as the National Agricultural and Normal Institute. For many years, Stephen and Hetty Haskell served on the board of managers. In addition to working for poor whites in Tennessee, the Haskells worked also among poor blacks in Alabama. They raised some funds for the Oakwood Industrial School in Huntsville and for other black schools across the South. They encouraged black students to sell copies of the Bible Training School magazine to help pay their way through school, their expenses, and to raise money to erect a new school buildings. Although born and raised in a lily-white region of Massachusetts, Stephen felt comfortable working with African Americans in the segregated South, which I think says a great deal about his open-mindedness. He grew up in a white section of the United States, but he was very much open racially to working among others. No doubt his racial tolerance also helped him make him a popular administrator. From 1908 to 1911, he served as president of the California Conference, and that's at a time when he was between 75 and 78 years of age. About your age, Jim. Yep. You're not eager to be California Conference president right now.
No, I don't think so.
No, I didn't think so either. So he's well past what we would consider retirement age. During his term in office, he faced several challenges. In 1909, proponents introduced 3 Sunday law bills into the California legislature. And these had the very, very strong support of the WCTU and the labor unions. So, both groups recognized, however, that Adventists, as the newspaper put it, are hard fighters. They have some good talkers, and their arguments appeal to the legislative mind. That's a nice quote. The church fought against these 3 Sunday bills, I should say. They collected over 35,000 signatures on petitions, every county in the state of California. Thanks largely to their well-coordinated efforts, all 3 Sunday bills failed to pass the legislature. But Elder Haskell also faced fanaticism inside the church, including attacks against Ellen White by her own nephew, Frank Belden. Now, we've seen a lot of Frank Belden's hymns, don't we, in church. Jim plays them on the organ. But Frank Belden ended his life not in the Adventist church. He was Ellen White's nephew. And there was another member whose last name is all I have, a Mr. Steele. And then the third one was H.E. Jones. We should have a segment on him, I think, maybe in 2019. H.E. Jones, a radical individualist. Jordan Knight calls him a Christian anarchist. How's that for a contradiction? A Christian anarchist. A.T. Jones continued attacking church leaders and the new church organizational structure he called Babylon. All three men were censured and placed on probation for 3 months in hopes they would change their behavior. When A.T. Jones refused to do that, the conference executive committee barred him from preaching in any Adventist churches. On a more positive note, Elder Haskell played a key role in relocating Healdsburg College to a 200-acre location on Howell Mountain near Angwin, where in 1908 it was renamed Pacific Union College, and that's still in existence today. One of our most beautiful campuses. Gorgeous mountain scenery. Under his administration, California was divided into 3 conferences, and they did it based on railroad transportation, climate conditions, and regional prosperity. He helped establish 26 new churches and many new church schools, and he raised the indebtedness of several of these institutions. Haskell was a good one for getting rid of debt. You know, he's one of those New England, what shall we say, we might call them stingy. On the other hand, we might call them careful money managers. And that's the way he was. He found ways to liquidate debt and succeeded in doing that for a number of our institutions. And he also confirmed believers' confidence in Ellen White's testimonies. But carrying out his administrative duties did not occupy all of Stephen's time. He continued holding evangelistic meetings, promoting the distribution of Adventist literature, and giving Bible studies to new converts. You see, Stephen Haskell had a reputation for thoroughly grounding new believers in the truth. Now, he didn't rush through as other evangelists did. He made sure they knew all of the doctrines of the church. And yet, all of his endeavors that I've just described led to exhaustion. He was exhausted. Hetty was exhausted. In February of 1911, Stephen wrote to General Conference President A.G. Daniels, "My wife and myself are on the point of breakdown physically. I do not know that I have felt more used up since the early days of the message. My wife is also just about used up. We need about 3 months rest, and then we will be ready for anything that comes." So in 1911, the Haskells moved back to Nashville to find that needed rest in the sunny South. After recuperating for a few months, Stephen had recharged his batteries, and he was ready for a new challenge. Having defeated 3 Sunday bills in California, he was next asked to go up to Maine, because in the state of Maine, they were fighting over prohibition. The state of Maine is the state that gave birth to the Children's Cold Water Army, Henry Hunt's Cold Water Army. Children marching by the hundreds in parades, holding up glasses of pure water. That was the only beverage they would ever drink the rest of their lives. Cold water armies. This time, of course, he had the WCTU on his side. During 1911 and 12, Haskell and his team organized a campaign to distribute 12,000 copies of a special temperance issue of the Review and 10,000 copies of a special temperance issue of the Youth Instructor throughout the whole state. And Lillian Stevens, who was the WCTU president in Maine, agreed to mobilize her workers to help them do this. Great cooperation there. Soon Adventists had to order an additional 23,000 copies of the Review and another 14,000 copies of the Youth Instructor, because there were so many demands for this temperance issue. In addition, they held temperance rallies. The end result was that the prohibitionists won in the state by 700 votes. Following this successful campaign, the Haskells moved to Portland, Maine, and established a city mission in 1912, which they largely funded out of their own pockets. For 6 months, their team held cooking schools and health schools every single week, while 3 nurses gave massages and other treatments. That fall, the couple moved once again, this time to their old stomping grounds in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, where they continued developing their publishing work for the blind. So they were pioneers in that area as well. Publications for the blind in Braille. But a tragic event in 1915 brought Elder Haskell back to Battle Creek. And as you can probably guess, that had to do with Ellen White. Remember, in February of 1915, Ellen White had tripped, broken her hip out there in Elms Haven, and 5 months later, July 16, she died. Now, Stephen was unable to attend the first two funerals, which were held in California, the Elms Haven property and the Oakland camp meeting. But he was asked by the family to preach her homily in Battle Creek at the Old Time Tabernacle. And so on Sabbath, July 24, 4,000 people crowded the church to hear the General Conference President, A.G. Daniels, present her life sketch. And then Elder Haskell preached a sermon, which is an interesting sermon. It combined a Bible study on the state of the dead and an evangelistic outreach appeal to the non-Adventist public and a comforting homily to Ellen White's friends and fellow Adventists. He got all three into one sermon, okay? All three. He concluded his remarks with a call for those present to be among those who would greet Mrs. White at the resurrection and enter the kingdom of glory. We don't do that much anymore at our funerals. We don't make calls. I did that once at a funeral. I felt inspired by the Holy Spirit to do that, but we don't do that very often anymore as our pioneers did. This is an opportunity for us to reach people at a funeral who are already thinking perhaps about their own demise, their own death. Are you ready to meet your Savior? And issue a call. Following the service, over 100 carriages, horse-drawn carriages, and 9 streetcars took the congregation of 4,000 to the cemetery, Oak Hill Cemetery, for the graveside service. The last major project Stephen and Hetty worked on together was the development of the Ellen G. White Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles, 1915. Understand, it's still there. When board members at the College of Medical Evangelists, that's called Loma Linda University today, recommended closing the institution. See, at the time it had a C rating, and the government was going to close down all medical institutions that didn't have at least a B rating. Hetty Haskell, Emma Gray, Dr. Florence Armstrong Keller, and Josephine Gottsian, these 4 women, offered to raise $61,000. That's a huge sum of money in those days. And they were going to apply that money to build and equip a clinical hospital named after Ellen White. One of their most effective fundraisers was selling postcards with pictures of pioneer ministers on them. Loughborough was on there, Butler, Haskell, Decker, Rogers. All of these men were over 80 by that time. They sold these postcards for 50 cents each. On April 21, 1918, the Haskells attended the dedication ceremony of the White Memorial Hospital. That's 100 years ago. And they rejoiced when the Council on Medical Education Accreditation body upgraded the status from C to B. And of course, not too long after that, it got an A rating as well. But only a few months after this triumph, Stephen faced another tragedy. Although she was only about 62, it seems young to many of us, Hetty faced a health crisis. She had started losing weight rapidly, and on July 28 was admitted to the New England Sanitarium for cancer surgery 3 days later. Her surgeon, Dr. W.A. Rubel, remarked that nothing but a mighty miracle of God could accomplish her healing. But the miracle did not happen. Instead, after lingering for 3 months, Hetty died on October 21, 1919. General Conference Secretary William A. Spicer entered into the General Conference Committee's minutes their deep appreciation for her labors, which, he said, are known in the churches of many lands and whose faith and devotion will ever be an inspiration and help to those who have known her. In addition, they extended to Stephen our deepest sympathy and love in this hour of sad affliction, assuring him of their prayers, and that God of all comfort may sustain and bless him in his sorrow. General Conference President Arthur G. Daniels conducted Hetty's funeral, and J.N. Loughborough, who had converted her, by the way, back in 1884, wrote her obituary in the Review. Her body was buried in the Eastwood Cemetery near South Lancaster. 5 days after Hetty's passing, Stephen informed Elder Spicer in a letter that she, Hetty, had been his right-hand helper spiritually, his nurse physically, and his best financial assistant. Hetty had also been an outstanding editor of the paper The Bible Training School. Without her help, Stephen felt unable to continue the magazine, and so his last issue appeared in January 1920. Once again, Stephen drowned his grief in work. Although in his mid-80s by now, he accepted a few invitations to speak at camp meetings and at church workers' institutes. Like Elder Loughborough, he also shared his memories about the pioneer days of the message with a new generation of young people who knew nothing about that. In addition, he continued giving Bible studies to new converts, and his favorite time for giving Bible studies was 5:30 or 6 o'clock a.m. That's an early hour for Bible study. Most of us are still sleeping. But Stephen was an early to bed, early to rise kind of fellow. His last news notes in the Review appeared in 1919, betraying his continued love of statistics, just like Loughborough. Statistics help to demonstrate the rise and progress of the Advent movement. In the spring of 1920, Elder Haskell, then 87, made a trip to California to visit with his old friend and ministerial colleague, J.N. Loughborough, who was at the St. Helena Sanitarium. The two elderly, white-bearded saints, dressed in their black three-piece suits, posed for a photograph with their Bibles on their laps. In the summer of 1921, the two aged pioneers visited for the last time at the sanitarium. The following year, the home missionary calendar featured Elder Haskell in a photo gallery that accompanied biographical sketches of 14 Adventist pioneers. When at age 89, he attended his last General Conference session. That was the San Francisco 1922 one. He was a delegate at large. He posed with 4 other aged pioneer preachers for a photo that was published in the Review. Recognizing that his advanced age and physical weakness no longer permitted him to live by himself, Elder Haskell entered Paradise Valley Sanitarium near San Diego in June 1922. Less than 4 months later, however, on October 9, he passed away in his 90th year. His old New England colleague, Elder Eugene Farnsworth, conducted the funeral service. When friends had asked him toward the end of his life which wife, Mary or Hetty, he preferred to be buried next to, he had always replied diplomatically, "Just place me beside the one I am nearest to when I die." Loughborough had to be asked the same question. He had 3 wives, so he was buried next to the last 2 in California. He now rests next to his first wife, Mary, in Tulaque Cemetery in Napa, California, where General Conference President Arthur Daniels officiated at the graveside service. So what legacy did Stephen Nelson Haskell pass along to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which he had served for 70 years? I tend to agree with Dr. Jerry Moon at Andrews, who has stated that very few exceeded Haskell in quantity, variety, and significance of accomplishments among pioneering Adventists. Perhaps James and Ellen White, Joseph Bates, and J.N. Loughborough outshone Haskell, but his accomplishments were nonetheless truly significant. During his long career, he filled the roles of preacher, evangelist, missionary, editor, author, administrator, and fundraiser, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, South Africa, Australia, and parts of Asia. His books are still available today in paperback reprints. Most of the conferences he led as president, including Northern and Southern New England, 3 in California, and several in the North Pacific Union, are still going strong today. And many of the institutions he founded or promoted, with the exception of Atlantic Union College, of course, but Southwestern Adventist University, Southern Adventist University, Oakwood University, Loma Linda University, are still in existence and doing quite well. We might mention that his wheeled fulcrum for removing tent stakes, called the Haskell, is still a useful tool to have around if you want to get a tent peg out of the ground quickly. We should also remember this tall giant of a man for several positive traits. He was a great lover of horses, especially spirited ones who liked to dance in the traces, as he put it. He exhibited that dry wit so characteristic of many New England Yankees. For example, in 1910, he described himself as a connoisseur of unfermented wines. In other words, grape juice. Like many Yankees, he was frugal, practicing the sternest self-denial, and Ellen White from time to time had to chide him a bit about his asceticism. And yet he could be wonderfully generous to those in need. Between 1907 and 1911, just 4 years, he estimated that he had given between $12,000 and $15,000 from the sales of his books to help the cause around the world. The records that I have looked at show that he gave $1,000 to an orphanage in Huntsville, Alabama, black orphanage. He gave $1,000 to Loma Linda, another $1,000 to Pacific Union College, another $1,000 to Melrose Sanitarium in Massachusetts, $5,000 to various institutions in India. Once, when the General Conference needed $3,000, the Haskells mortgaged their home and provided $3,000 for the Battle Creek headquarters. One of the little-known facts about Elder Haskell, however, is that he, like J.N. Loughborough, struggled with depression from time to time, particularly late in his life. Because he suffered from infections, carbuncles, blood poisoning, boils, and frequent bouts of pneumonia, medical specialists today might diagnose his depression as rooted in his physiological problems. But Stephen Haskell saw it as demonic in nature. He wrote an interesting letter to Ellen White in April of 1893. God alone knows the struggles and conflicts I have at times with the powers of darkness. I have felt that there was a still fiercer struggle going on in my own soul, which I could not and dared not open to any earthly friend. I have awakened some nights saying, "Give me victory or give me death." Then victory would come for a time. And then after days and nights of conflict with temptations of Satan, I would awaken uttering these words, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I will place my will on the side of the will of Christ." This has brought a victory and freedom from these particular temptations for weeks and even months. He begged Ellen White for help. Is there no abiding freedom from these dark conflicts? He asked. In 2 letters that she wrote to him, February 13, 1888, January 1, 1902, Ellen encouraged Stephen to look to Christ. Will you take God at his word? Will you believe he means just what he says? Will you believe that your whole spirit and soul and body may be sanctified? Lie low at his feet, at the foot of the cross, subdued, broken, but taking hold of his strength. That is all you need. We must break the force of Satan's suggestions by living actual faith. God has said it, and it will be done. He will be to you a present help in every time of need. Be strong in the Lord. Yea, be strong. Be careful to get quietness as much as possible. The Lord does not place upon you burdens so heavy that you cannot carry them without sacrificing your mental, moral, and spiritual capabilities. What a letter of encouragement. Thankfully, Elder Haskell, like Elder Loughborough, heeded Mrs. White's advice. And at the very end of his life, he enjoyed a deeper spiritual experience in Christ. If, as William Shakespeare puts it, all's well that ends well, then I think we can say that Stephen Haskell's life ended well. Like his close friend John Loughborough, Haskell was, after all, one of the very last of the original pioneers when he died in his 90th year in 1922. And I think that you and I would do well to study his life and to emulate his positive traits and example. Good man, Stephen Haskell. Well, you've had 3 weeks, beginning of winter here, to cogitate and think about some questions. Adventist history. I'll be happy to entertain those now. Jim?
I was just thinking in a Sacrifice Commitment book that HMS Richardson, he was a young minister up in Canada. This was around the year 1921 or so. Haskell was near 90.
Yep.
He made an appeal for more songbooks, Christ's song he needed for his Adventist meetings.
Yes.
So afterwards, Haskell met him at the edge of the tent and emptied the contents of his wallet, which was a little more than $7, everything he had. Richard said, I was able to get me several copies of the songbooks. So he wasn't afraid of emptying his pocketbook for a good cause.
Characteristic, I think. A man that was willing to sacrifice, give whatever he had for the cause.
So Haskell knew HMS Richards?
Pardon?
So
Yeah, that was HMS Richards Sr., yeah.
Senior.
Yeah.
Senior.
That was the one that was across the young.
Yeah. And he would have been,
minister up in Canada in those years.
right, he would have been a young man in those years.
Probably in his mid to late 20s at that.
Yeah. Questions from this side? Questions from the back?
How old was Haskell when he died?
I didn't catch that.
Haskell was 90 when he passed?
90.
And
Yeah.
what year was it?
He was in his 90th year, 1922. We're not exactly sure, as I mentioned in part 1, whether he was born in 32 or 33. Not the statistics, the birth records are not crystal clear on that. So that's why I say he was in his 90th year. He may have been 90 already, or he was 89, pushing 90. But he was right up there in the league with Loughborough. You know, I mean, Loughborough was 92 when he died. Yes.
Outlived both of his wives.
How old?
He outlived both.
Oh yeah, he outlived both of his, as Loughborough outlived 3 wives. Yes, yes. Which, you know, is kind of unusual. Usually we think of the males dying first and women outliving the husband. Yeah. Jim?
You mentioned his connection with Madison at some point. Did he ever teach at Madison?
I don't know that he taught there like he did at Avondale. We do know he taught at Avondale. But he and Hetty were instrumental in helping to get it off the ground and get it started anyway. But, yeah, I don't know that he taught there.
Our son was born in Madison Hospital.
Oh, is that right?
It's kind of the remnant of what's left.
Ah. Yeah, I have a second cousin, Mrs. Johnson, who taught at the church school there for many years when I was in college back in the 60s and 70s. So I made a visit there with my roommate who was from Madison. And I was quite impressed. I was quite impressed with the campus and the school there. We have, I mean, if you're interested in doing any kind of research on Madison, we have their full collection at the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews. We just got that a year ago. So all of the Madison records and books and papers, and all that good stuff, you know, Sutherland, McGann, we've got that now at the Center for Adventist Research. Yeah.
So, and maybe he might not be a pioneer, but you have stories of HMS Richards, like his life, like you have the other pioneers, even though he's not really a pioneer. But I would be interested in hearing about HMS Richards.
There has been a book written by one of the quartet. Thank you. Trying to think which one. Bob Edwards of the quartet, the Voice of Prophecy Quartet, has written a biography of HMS Richards. I don't know for 100% whether it's still in print or not, but it's fairly recent. You may find it in camp meeting. Well done.
But you don't have anything.
No, and if I do one on Richards, it will be from that book because that's the only source that I know.
I just like to hear your story.
Oh, well, thank you. We also have the HMS Richards collection at the Center for Adventist Research. Lots and lots of footage of notes, sermon notes, films, you know. I don't know why they didn't give it to Loma Linda, but we're thankful that they decided to give it to Andrews. So we've got that at the Center for Adventist Research.
Do we have any sound recordings of
Yes.
those early
Yes,
pioneers?
we do. Again, at the Center for Adventist Research. Yes, and we're digitizing it. We are making great progress. You know, I'm a friend of CAR, is what they call me, and so I'm on the archives board. And we're making great progress on digitizing all those old Voice of Prophecy tapes, because you know they're reel to reel. That's old, and it deteriorates with time.
What about some of the old Adventist pioneers, though? Do we have any sound recordings of?
Not many. Yeah, would that we could. Not many. Because back in their high day in the 19th century, you don't have very many reliable ways of recording the human voice. I mean, until you get vinyl records, and that's late. I don't remember the exact year, but that's like 1880s and 1890s. We don't have the means of recording the human voice very reliably. And of course, those that are recorded by that means, that also deteriorates relatively quickly, because we're talking about, 120 years plus. But we are investing a lot of time and money in digitizing, because that's the way to preserve the old audio and visual records, is to digitize them. Then it's available to everybody, through the internet on the computer. So I applaud and I support with my funds the efforts to do that. It's the only way to preserve the past, because none of us have anymore, reel-to-reel film projectors. Some of us don't even remember them. Jim, you have your hand up? No.
I was going to ask a question, though. South Lancaster, of course, Haskell figured in very prominently with this.
Yes.
And I think was a forerunner of Atlantic Union College.
Yes.
Now the college, of course, is closed down.
Right.
But is the academy still in operation?
Academy, as far as I know, yes, we were told that it's still doing okay. Yeah. AUC's grounds look great, We were there, we saw them, they're well manicured, buildings look great, but it's kind of like walking through a cemetery. No people, no people. They have tried a couple, 3 times to sell it, but nobody has apparently snapped it up. It could, fit very nicely as an educational institution for somebody else, but so far, they haven't been able to sell it.
There were some artifacts in there at Atlantic Community College that I'd like to see get preserved.
Oh, definitely.
All that Israel.
Definitely. And if worse comes to worse on that, I think that Jim Ford and Merlin Burt at Andrews, the Center for Adventist Research, would urge that they be sent down there so that we could have them well preserved there. Well, I promised Ken a special treat tonight, so maybe we'll just close with that. As he has mentioned several times, he subscribes to the Journal Era because he enjoys very much reading my column. The passion is always present. The problem is, my column has been